620,000. That is how many soldiers died in the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the history of the United States. More Americans died in that single war than in World War I and World War II combined. One man held the country together through all of it. One man made the decisions that determined whether America survived or collapsed into two broken nations. One man signed the document that freed 4 million people with a single stroke of his pen. That man grew up with no shoes, no school, and no floor beneath him, just dirt. His mother died when he was 9 years old. He never spent a single full year inside a classroom. He failed in business. He lost elections. He battled depression so severe that his friends hid knives from him to keep him safe. And today, 160 years after a bullet ended his life in a crowded Washington theater, historians still cannot find a single president to rank above him. Not Washington, not Roosevelt, not Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln. How does that happen? How does a child born with absolutely nothing become the man who saved a nation? That is exactly what you are going to find out. Abraham Lincoln was born on the 12th of February, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on Nolan Creek in Hardin County, Kentucky. The cabin measured roughly 18 feet by 16 feet. It had one window, no glass, just a gap covered with greased paper to let in a little light. The floor was bare earth. There was a single fireplace, a crude wooden table, and a sleeping loft where Abraham and his older sister Sarah huddled together for warmth in the winters. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter who moved the family constantly, always chasing land that might yield a better harvest, always coming up just short. Thomas was not a cruel man, but he was a beaten one, worn down by a frontier life that demanded everything and gave back very little. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was something else entirely. By all accounts, Nancy was a quiet, deeply intelligent woman with a warmth that everyone who knew her remembered long after she was gone. She could not read or write, almost nobody in her world could, but she had a gift for stories. She told young Abraham tales from the Bible, from folklore, from whatever scraps of narrative had drifted her way, and the boy absorbed them with a hunger that surprised even her. Abraham was, from his very earliest years, different. And though he was tall for his age, freakishly tall, all limbs and angles, and quiet in a way that unsettled people, he did not play like other boys. He watched, he listened. He asked questions that grown men found difficult to answer, and when he learned something, a word, a fact, an idea, he turned it over in his mind until he had wrung every drop of meaning from it. But there was almost nothing to learn from in the Kentucky wilderness of 1809. The nearest school was miles away, operated intermittently by teachers who were themselves barely educated. Abraham attended for a total of less than 12 months across his entire childhood. 12 months. That is all the formal education the man who would reshape America ever received. What he had instead was a ferocious, almost obsessive drive to teach himself. He borrowed every book he could find, which in rural Kentucky in the 1810s was not many. He read the Bible. He read Aesop's fables. He read a dog-eared copy of Pilgrim's Progress until the pages fell apart. He wrote out passages by hand on a wooden shovel with a piece of charcoal when he had no paper. He did sums in the dirt with a stick. He was building himself an education out of almost nothing, and he was doing it entirely alone. Then, in the autumn of 1818, when Abraham was 9 years old, a disease swept through the settlement. It was called milk sickness, caused by drinking milk from cows that had grazed on white snake root. It moved fast, and it killed fast. Within days, Nancy Lincoln was bedridden. Within a week, she could barely speak. Abraham watched his mother die. He was 9 years old. He held her hand. He listened to her breathe, slower and slower and slower, until she did not anymore. Nancy Lincoln was 34 years old. She was buried on a hill near the cabin, wrapped in wooden planks that Thomas and Abraham cut and fitted themselves. There was no funeral service. There was no minister. There was just a grave on a hill, and a boy standing beside it in the cold, trying to understand something that no 9-year-old should have to understand. Abraham Lincoln never fully recovered from losing his mother. In his adult life, he spoke about her with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. He once said that everything he was, everything good in him, he owed to her. A woman he had known for only 9 years. A woman who could not read or write. A woman buried in an unmarked grave on a Kentucky hillside. The loss did not break him, but it changed him, permanently, irreversibly, in ways that would shape everything that followed. A year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln returned with a new wife, a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Sarah brought 3 children of her own, some furniture, and something Abraham had never really had before: warmth. Sarah Lincoln took one look at Abraham and recognized something in him immediately. She cleaned him up, clothed him properly, and, most importantly, encouraged him to read. She brought books into the house. She told Thomas to let the boy be, to let him learn. Thomas Lincoln thought reading was a waste of time. Abraham was already pulling away from his father, intellectually, emotionally, in every way that mattered. But with Sarah's encouragement, Abraham read everything. He walked miles to borrow books. But he stayed up so late by the firelight that he ruined his eyesight. He read and read and read, and slowly, painfully, he began to construct in his mind an idea of a world beyond the dirt floor and the cold cabin in the Kentucky wilderness. A world he was determined, somehow, to reach. In 1830, when Abraham Lincoln was 21 years old, the family moved to Illinois. Abraham, now legally an adult, decided he was done following his father. He struck out on his own. He was 21 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, with less than a year of formal education, no money, no profession, no connections, and no clear plan. What he had was an absolute refusal to accept that the life he had been born into was the only life available to him. The next decade would test that refusal to its very limits. He tried everything. He worked as a farmhand. He split rails for fences, brutal, back-breaking work that paid almost nothing. He managed a mill. He tried running a small general store in the village of New Salem, Illinois. The store failed. His business partner died, leaving Abraham with a mountain of debt that would take him years to repay. Debt he referred to, with dark humor, as the national debt. He ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1832. He lost. He tried again. He won. He served. He began to teach himself law, reading borrowed law books by firelight, alone and in the dark, building himself piece by piece. In 1836, he passed the bar exam and became a licensed attorney. He had done it entirely through self-study. Not one day of law school, not one professor. Just books and will and years of relentless grinding effort. And he was good in the courtroom. Genuinely, remarkably good. He had a gift for making complex things simple, for speaking plainly in a way that juries found immediately trustworthy. His reputation grew, but success in the courtroom could not protect him from the blows that life kept delivering. In 1835, a young woman named Anne Rutledge, widely believed to be the first great love of Lincoln's life, died of typhoid fever. By multiple accounts, the grief nearly destroyed him. Friends watched him closely for weeks, afraid of what he might do to himself. He survived, but the darkness stayed with him. Abraham Lincoln suffered from what we would today call severe clinical depression. He called it the hypo. There were periods in his life when he could barely get out of bed. Periods when friends removed knives from his room because they did not trust him alone with them. He was not a man who found life easy. He was a man who found life extraordinarily difficult and kept going anyway. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, sharp, educated, and complicated, who saw something in the lanky, self-educated lawyer that others missed. Together, they would have 4 sons. 3 would not survive to adulthood. Lincoln served in Congress from 1847 to 1849. He took an unpopular stand against the Mexican-American War and paid for it politically. He returned to Springfield, and by the early 1850s, it appeared his political career was over. He was in his mid-40s. A modest success as a lawyer, a failed stint in Congress, and a life marked by grief, debt, depression, and disappointment. And then something happened that changed everything. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively reopened the question of whether slavery could expand into new American territories. Lincoln had always found slavery morally repugnant, but this act ignited something in him that had never fully burned before. He re-entered politics. He was not the same man who had shuffled out of Congress 5 years earlier. He was older, sharper, and he had developed, through years of courtroom argument, an ability to speak about complex moral questions with a clarity and force that was genuinely extraordinary. He ran for U.S. Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. The 2 men debated across Illinois in a series of arguments that drew enormous crowds and national attention. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but the debates made him famous. And they showed a man who could speak about slavery not just as a political problem, but as a profound moral wrong, in language so clear and so human that it was almost impossible to dismiss. He had lost again, but this loss was different. This loss was the beginning of something. In May 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as their candidate for President of the United States. It was, by any measure, an astonishing development. Lincoln was not the favorite. He had never held major national office. He was considered a dark horse, a compromise choice. But Lincoln had something the other candidates lacked. He had a voice, and he had a message. The country he was seeking to lead was fracturing along a fault line that had run through American life since the founding. The question of slavery. The southern states had built their entire economy on enslaved labor. The northern states were increasingly opposed to its expansion. The two sides were no longer talking. They were threatening. Lincoln won the election of 1860 without carrying a single southern state. Before he even took office, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union. By the time Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address, speaking directly to the South in a voice that was quiet and firm and heartbreaking in its restraint, the Confederate States of America had already declared themselves a separate nation. 6 weeks later, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was 4 years that would have broken almost any other man who ever lived. Lincoln was not a military man. His generals were cautious or incompetent, or both. The casualty numbers coming back from the battlefields were staggering. At Antietam on the 17th of September, 1862, more than 22,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. A single day. It remains the bloodiest day in American military history. Lincoln read every casualty report. He met with families of the dead when he could. He wrote personal letters of condolence, hundreds of them by hand in the quiet hours of the night. He barely slept. He barely ate. The photographs taken of him early in his presidency and those taken near the end tell the story more powerfully than any words can. The man aged a decade for every year in office. The weight of what he was carrying was written on his face for the entire world to see. His own cabinet doubted him. Members of his own party called for him to negotiate with the South, to end the war, even if it meant allowing slavery to continue. Lincoln refused. He had come to believe, with a certainty that nothing could shake, that the war was not just about preserving the Union. It was about something larger, something that 4 million enslaved human beings were waiting at tremendous cost for America to finally mean. On the 22nd of September, 1862, 5 days after the carnage at Antietam, Lincoln called his cabinet together and told them what he had decided. He was going to free the slaves. His cabinet was stunned. Lincoln listened to all of them and then told them the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And 4 million people, 4 million human beings who had been legally defined as property, were declared free. It was not the end. The war would rage for 2 more years, but the meaning of the war had changed. Irrevocably, permanently. Every Union soldier now fought not just to preserve a political union, but to end an institution that had defined American life and American shame for 2.5 centuries. Lincoln won re-election in November 1864, in the middle of the war. The country chose to see it through. And then, in the spring of 1865, the war began to end. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April, 1865. The bloodiest war in American history was over. More than 620,000 soldiers had died, but the Union was whole, and slavery was finished. Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address on the 4th of March, 1865. It is considered by many the greatest speech ever given by an American president. He did not gloat. He did not blame. He spoke of binding up the nation's wounds, of caring for those who had borne the battle, of achieving a just and lasting peace. He had led America through hell, and now he was asking it, gently, firmly, with everything he had, to find its way back to grace. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of the 14th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln went to the theater. He had not wanted to go. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. The exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of a nation for 4 years and had only just, finally, been allowed to set it down. But tickets had been announced. The public expected him. So he went. Ford's Theater in Washington was packed. The play was a popular comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln sat in the presidential box above the stage, laughing for the first time in what felt like years, his hand holding Mary's across the armrest between their chairs. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth stepped into the presidential box and fired a single shot from a small Derringer pistol into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Lincoln slumped forward. He never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to Peterson House and laid diagonally across a bed that was too short for his 6'4" frame. Doctors worked through the night. Mary sat in the hallway, unable to enter, unable to leave. At 7:22 in the morning on the 15th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. That he was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at his bedside and spoke the words that history has never forgotten. He said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The grief that swept the country was unlike anything America had ever experienced. Hundreds of thousands of people, black and white, rich and poor, soldiers and civilians, waited in lines that stretched for miles to pay their respects. His body was then placed on a funeral train that traveled 1,654 miles from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, stopping in city after city so that the people could say goodbye. Everywhere the train stopped, people gathered. In the middle of the night, in the pouring rain, in towns so small they barely appeared on maps. People came. They came because he was one of them. He had always been one of them. The boy from the log cabin who had never forgotten where he came from, who had never stopped speaking the language of ordinary people, who had never, not once, not even at the height of his power, lost the humility that poverty had pressed into him from the very beginning. Abraham Lincoln is consistently ranked by historians as the greatest president the United States has ever produced. Not because his life was easy, not because he was born to greatness or power or privilege. Precisely because he was not. He was born in a log cabin with a dirt floor, in the cold, to a family that owned almost nothing. He lost his mother at 9. He buried friends, children, and colleagues. He fought depression his entire adult life. He failed in business. He lost elections. He was mocked and underestimated by people who should have known better. And through all of it, through every loss, every failure, every dark night of the soul, he kept going. He kept reading, kept learning, kept building himself into something the world had not seen before. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the preservation of the Union, the words of the Gettysburg Address, carved into marble and memorized by schoolchildren and whispered by people who love what America is supposed to be. All of it came from that boy in the log cabin. The boy with no shoes. The boy with the cold floor and the dead mother and the book he read by firelight because no one was going to hand him anything, and he knew it, and he decided that knowing it was enough. Abraham Lincoln did not just become the greatest American president. He proved something that the world needed, and still needs, to hear. That where you start is not where you have to end. That the size of a life is not measured by the size of the room you were born in. That the most extraordinary things in history have been built again and again by people who had nothing, except the refusal to accept that nothing was all they would ever have. That's all for today. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please hit like and subscribe to The Vault. We tell a new story every single week. Stories of the people who changed the world, told the way they were meant to be told. Turn on the bell so you never miss one. We will see you in the next one.